Hello! Today you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel, and today we have our next 2024 U.S. presidential election forecast. Now, before I begin, I'd like to once again shout out all my channel members. I really appreciate all the support you guys give the channel and make a lot of this stuff possible. And if you want to support the channel, by all means, go and link in the description below and press that join button. Otherwise, just do your regular YouTube things like share, subscribe, and comment below. But with no further ado, let us begin. So, Trump has retaken some ground. Now, he's always been in the lead in my tracking. If we see here, he has always been winning the most popular seats, or electoral college votes, I should say. But for a while, from September 9th to this update, he was trailing in popular vote. And now he's back in front in popular vote. And that might be surprising. I've been seeing a lot of people ruminating on Twitter, in the media, why is Trump rebounding all of a sudden? And I think what we see here is something we have just seen in other elections. In fact, we see this in almost every election. In fact, we see this almost always. See, there is a phenomenon called the leader bump. Now, the leader bump is this phenomenon where when a party gets a new leader, both some of its leaning supporters who were on the fence about voting become more activated and more willing to vote, at least temporarily. And some of the people who are on the fence but currently planning to vote for the other guy might pull back a bit. Maybe the other person isn't that bad. Now, usually, these leader bumps either A, cool off, or B, turn into a runaway landslide effect. But usually they cool off. It's very rare you see runaway landslides. And I will note, too, sometimes the cooling off happens almost immediately, and there is no meaningful bump to the new leader. For sake of argument here, to explain the point, I will use a case where there was no leadership bump. And that is the case of Nova Scotia right now, where in July 2022, so roughly around to this point, the NS Liberals elected a new leader, Zach Churchill, who no one knows. And you could say, okay, their polling jumped up a little bit. But before this, it was kind of around this anyways, and then it kind of bumps anyways. So the point is, there is really no obvious or discernible bump here, and there's especially almost no discernible movement in the PCs, or the NDP, or the Greens. That is a case of almost zero leadership bump. Conversely, we'll use another Canadian example for this because these are the easiest for me because I'm Canadian, obviously. We have Ontario. Stephen Del Duca becomes the leader of the Liberals in 2020, around March. And suddenly, the Liberals shoot up. They're hitting 5, 9, 5, 8. Before this, they were mediocre. And then it fades off. And that happens quite a bit. So what I think we saw with Kamala Harris is that there was this kind of leadership bump. Now, this leadership bump wasn't observed in the same way that a lot of leadership bumps were. Because if you look at raw polling, Harris really hasn't moved very much. I'll use RCP here because it's the easiest way to demonstrate this. You'll see here, yeah, Harris jumped a bit, but she's hovering around 49 for the last month. Like, she's not declined. And this 48 was pretty stable too, until early September when the campaign started. So why did she jump up originally? Well, she jumped up originally because right here in July, early August, June, July, backwards months here, the Democrats are heavily suppressed in their voter share because a lot of their voters see Joe Biden as unfit for office because of his mental state. So at this point, the Democrats are really suppressed, and you have third parties like Kennedy who are posing a serious siphon of votes because a lot of Democrats are not really interested in voting for Biden anymore. And you can see at the same time, Trump is quite low. He really only peaks around 48% here. At like the peak of the news cycle of the assassination attempt, Biden dropping out, the debate, all that stuff. And as soon as Harris comes in, they have a different leader, it re-energizes the base, and it bumps them upwards, and it pushes the Republicans down, pushes Trump down. That's important. This, the depression of the Republican vote, is the leadership bump, in my suspicion, my assertion. So what we're seeing now is that this support here, around 48 in raw polling for Trump, was the correct amount of support by polling. And then for much of August and September, his vote was suppressed because voters hadn't gotten to know Harris yet. Harris was still an unknown quantity to a lot of people, and a lot of people who were leaning Trump, but weren't sold on Trump, were just thinking about staying home, or possibly maybe voting Democrat, or maybe voting for a third party, or various other reasons. But what we're seeing now is a lot of these voters have decided, oh wait, no, we can't have Harris. We're near the end of the election. This is the point where people decide, and things like this fizzle out. And now you see this sharp, clear rise for Trump. And we're not just seeing quote unquote Republican pollsters like Rasmussen, who's not actually a Republican pollster, though his polls are friendly to the Republicans, but that there's many pollsters that are lean Democrat in their polling, like Morning Consult. But you have things like pollsters like TIP, Alice Intel, Fox News, and Fox News pollsters pretty unbiased. It's not a biased pollster. All have Trump leading now. And then other ones like Emerson have a shift. NBC News has a shift. A bunch of these are shifting Trump. Okay, so that might explain why there's a rebound here, but how? I just showed you all these polls from Real Clear. And to be clear, I'm using pollsters that Real Clear doesn't use as well. Ones at 538 or Decision Desk HQ also use as well. You might think to yourself, okay, great, why do you have Trump leading? The simple answer to that is Trump is usually underpolled. Now, my polling model is slightly more sophisticated than just saying, aha, you get missed more, so therefore you get more vote. But if you really want to break it down into a first order approximation, that's exactly what my polling model does. You get missed more often, therefore you get more boost. And under the Trump era, Trump does get missed more. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First one, his voter base heavily leans rural, more so than under the Obama era or before that, where the rural votes are more evenly split. The more rural voters a party has, the more likely they'll be underpolled because those voters don't respond to polls often. Similar story, you have a well-documented effect called the Shai-Tory effect, which really comes into play with someone like Trump. You could say the same thing with a lot of parties where slander ads are used heavily, and that is very true for Trump. A lot of the Democrat campaign against Trump is that Trump is just a bad person. Now, you may think he's a bad person, and that's all fine and dandy, but that doesn't cause voters who don't think that to be scared to say it. And that's the important thing I will note when I've talked about before with slander ads. And the reason I use the term slander ad is because the goal of such an ad isn't to change anyone's minds about voting for you. It's just to convince them, or try to convince them not to vote for the other guy. Or to demoralize the other guy so he quits, which is the more common result. Or gets forced out by his party. They might be factually true statements, depending on the circumstance. Often they're not true, but many times they can be factually true. But that doesn't matter, because the truth content of a slander ad is not the purpose. The purpose is to try to defame somebody. Or, I rephrase this, defame is loaded. It's to try to make people dislike somebody on their character, not on their policies, not on their actions in government. Just, this is a bad person because he said this mean thing, or he has done this mean action, or something like that. For example of this, focusing heavily the Democrat campaign, putting ads out and commenting out that, you shouldn't vote for Trump, he's a felon, is a very much exact circumstance like that. Technically, it is literally true. But it's not saying you shouldn't vote for Trump because he's not a good candidate or he has bad policies. They're just saying you shouldn't vote for Trump because he's a bad person, which is usually not a very persuasive message, and usually just causes the things like shy Tory effect to skyrocket because people don't want to admit it. Though at a certain point it might short circuit and they might be admitting it. So this is to say, there is always a possibility right now that dynamics can change, and modeling that I am currently doing, which estimates a certain amount of polling miss, could be wrong. That's very possible. But it's very unlikely that this polling miss would favor Harris. If there is less polling miss than 2020, it just means that Trump doesn't get as big of a bump as he did in 2020. That's not a very big difference. Now, one thing I will say in regard to polling in the US is usually the average of polls is pretty accurate to what the Democrats actually get. Democrat response rate for their base seems to line up pretty tightly with the actual response rate of the poll. And that is before you remove undecideds, I should note. Those usually line up pretty well. The Republicans usually overperform this. This is true in the 2020 the 2020 cycle, where in most circumstances they did overperform polls. It's just often not by enough. Now, there is a few Senate races where they don't do that, but that's a whole different dynamics that I make an entire video out of, which I don't want to, because it's, who cares? People who overfocus on one particular cycle when it comes to stuff like this, I think, are missing the forest for the trees. Okay, so we established, Trump's leading, okay. There's a couple of states that are within margin of error. There is some play here. Again, it's not impossible that Harris could win. She only needs to win roughly 4 points across the swing states to actually pull out a win. That's certainly and objectively a thing that could happen. My model doesn't estimate probabilities because it just doesn't work like that way. I have a deterministic model, not a probabilistic one. But this all said, it's certainly a possibility that Harris could win. It just gets less likely as time goes on with the current trends. Trends can change, of course. But there's really not much to the Harris campaign, which is why there isn't likely going to be a change in dynamics. The only thing that could really cause the shift is if Trump screws up. But it's very difficult for Trump to screw up because Trump's a very known quantity. He has nearly 100% name recognition, and he's been a forefront of US politics since 2015, more or less. And before that, he was a famous billionaire celebrity. So Trump's a pretty well-known quantity. The only potential hiccup, and this is why you saw the Harris team really try to dive in on it, was when he picked Vance. And not because there's anything wrong with J.D. Vance per se, other than you might not like his ideology, but as a candidate for Republican, J.D. Vance is a fine Republican candidate. However, he's a very unknown quantity. So the Democrats were trying to hit him on that. Unfortunately, it did not work very well. Because I don't really think the Democrats know who they're trying to reach here. And it's kind of the same situation you see in Canada with the Liberal Party, where they don't really know who they're trying to reach. And I'll elaborate on that. So, you win an election primarily by identifying your base, shoring up your base, and then identifying other groups you can expand into. That sounds pretty straightforward, but it's actually way more complicated than you think, because the new groups you expand into cannot alienate groups you already have. That's very difficult. That's where the art of politics comes in. It's more of an art than a science, even as I apply data science techniques to it to get models like this. But it's still more art than science. And the political science major or field is more art than science itself. It's pretty unscientific, frankly. Frankly, it's really kind of just glorified history, the better parts of poli-sci. But the Democrats' issue here is they don't know who they're appealing to. Obviously, you have women who really care about abortions locked in. To a lesser extent, you have the people who really care about gun control locked in. Sort of have people who care about healthcare, but a lot of them who are really concerned about healthcare want universal or single payer, and the Democrats will never deliver on that, so a lot of them are very apprehensive about it, because a dirty secret in the US is no mainstream politician actually wants single payer, and none of them will ever do it. They all look at Canada and see, oh wait, there's a lot of problems with single payer. Let's not do that. Let's do something different. Now, you could argue, and I won't go into this for this video, that maybe the benefits of single payer outweigh the cons. Sure, but you're not the US political establishment. To them, it doesn't weigh up the cons. And I have this on pretty good credence because I know people in the Democrat Party in states like California who tell me this. Okay, and then you have possibly the progressive sides who are sort of locked in. Sometimes they go Democrat. Most of the time they go Democrat. Like the kind of Bernie Sanders types. They're like soft Democrat supports. They might not vote or spoil their ballot or other stuff like that. But they usually will break Democrat overall. And when I say break Democrat, I mean like more than will vote Democrat than will not vote. Those are like the core overarching groups the Democrats have right now. And that's where they run into an issue. Because they don't really know how to expand from there. Because a lot of their rhetoric and a lot of their discussions and a lot of their tactics vis-a-vis abortion alienate a lot of other people. This is why abortion's actually a losing issue for the Democrats, but they don't really realize it because it on paper, it polls well, but first off, issue polls are basically lies. Voters don't think like that. Very few people are single-issue voters, as I guess is what I'll say. But second, it kind of belies a truth here, because the most aggressive polls for this might say like 46, 48% support the Democrats on abortion. They need more than 46 or 48% of the vote to win the election. Right now, they need to win by 2 or 3 to win the election. So that means that at 48%, Trump can't be doing better than 45%, which means that they need a huge spoiler to win on that. Now, you might ask yourselves, okay, why is abortion such an alienating issue for people? Well, first off, the U.S. has a very strong amount of pro-lifers, a very large quantity. Most people in the U.S. favor some kind of abortion restrictions, about 2/3. It doesn't mean 2/3 want to ban it, but roughly 2/3 want some limits somewhere. Many of them want a ban. But the other big issue is Christians, and specifically men, are really alienated by this conversation, by this debate, by this topic. Because faithful Christians obviously usually don't countenance abortion, period. So it alienates them outright. We saw recently in a rally somewhere, Kamala Harris shouting at people, chanting Christian slogans, go to a different rally. And this was in response to her talking about abortion, to be clear. And it alienates men because this issue is so thoroughly feminized. It's only about women to the Democrats. And you could say, okay, but it's about, quote unquote, women's right to choose. But their language for it is very alienating. You'll see ads where they say, you should vote for Democrat for her, and such like that. Now, I don't think they realize how alienating that kind of ad is, because that's what you're saying with a lot of these campaign materials, is that if you are a man in the U.S., that there's actually no affirmative reason to vote for the Democrats. The only reason to vote for the Democrats is because you are personally very pro-choice, and that's your number one issue. Or maybe a girl in your life is very, very pro-choice, and you really care about her opinion, and you will vote on her request, which is a very small percentage of voters anyways. Very few people will vote some way just because one person in their life said so. Usually they're already inclining that way. I guess I'll rephrase this. For example, you'll see in married couples, most married couples will vote the same way. But that's not necessarily because, like, the husband or the wife is convincing the husband or their spouse to vote one way. It's usually because, shockingly, married couples tend to ideologically align over time. But that's another video for another time. I won't go into that here. And this is really the big issue. And I will be clear, this is true if you run on social conservative issues as well. But the issue with running on social issues is they are necessarily, inherently, and always divisive. Now, that divisiveness might play in your favor if it's something that's so productively divisive. If it wedges only people who are voting for you, who might vote for you, and wedges against people who would never vote for you anyways. For example, the BC Conservatives in BC recently did very well in the town of Surrey, way better than anyone expected, on Saturday as of recording this. Largely, likely, because a lot of South Asians in Surrey were persuaded to vote for them because of things like Soji, which is it's a whole set of left-wing school reforms, including, which I won't get into here, but you can look into it, but that kind of education reforms really helped persuade a lot of voters to vote for the BC Conservatives in an otherwise NDP or left-wing area. Okay. So what can Harris do then? Because she has to keep talking about abortion, because a lot of these supporters in her party, her core base that she has herself chosen, this was not Biden's base, the base she chose, necessitates her to keep talking about abortion. Which is why I've gone on record before to say that abortion is actually a trap for the Democrats. And a successful Republican campaign does entail baiting them to continually step on this rake. because it's a very unproductive and useless conversation for them to have. It doubles down on voters who were only ever going to vote Democrat, but at the same token, if they let up on the rhetoric once they have it started, they can lose those voters because it can look like they're giving up on such an important issue to them. It's a very bad issue to campaign on. It is a losing issue, and that's most of Kamala Harris's campaign. You don't campaign on social issues. That is always a losing proposition. Unless, again, it's so one-sidedly polarized that you can only gain voters from it. So what, instead, could Harris have done? Well, the natural thing to do as the vice president inheriting from a one-term president, would be to try to pitch a carrying forward vision of the economy, of the economic policies. But not only is the economy, the average voter perceives the economy as bad, Harris also completely and utterly ran away from Biden's position. Tim Walz and Kamala Harris have basically disavowed tariffs entirely. Biden raised tariffs on China and very heavily disavowed the protectionism that Biden advanced. Trump did it too, but Biden really advanced it. The Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. Those are things that the Democrats should be campaigning on. Because at the moment I write this video in 2024, they appear to be extremely successful at their actual intended purpose. However, they're very protectionist. And ideologically, it seems Kamala Harris doesn't like protectionism. So she's running away from those things. And running away from those economic issues, she's not really substituting them with anything else, or anything else that's palatable to the American worker. The average American right now does not want to hear stuff about trade liberalization. They don't really want to hear about the various left-wing economic proposals. They want, generally speaking, at least the voters who matter in this particular election, i.e. the ones who can be the swing voters. This is not just in the Midwest, but the swing voters in this election are overwhelmingly unionized men. Yeah, they're unionized men. That is the dominant swing voter in this particular election. That's the person in the Rust Belt. And, growingly, Georgia, Arizona. Georgia and Arizona are two states that are heavily benefiting from the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. Once again, asinine that Harris is running away from these things, because those are two things that she could trumpet to Arizona and Georgia. But instead, she wastes her campaign discussing or continually talking about the importance of abortion, or Project 2025, which almost no one's heard of. In fact, many of you might not have heard of it until I mentioned it in this video. And in a sense, it's just a masterclass of a bad campaign. She never properly sat down to identify who her winnable voters were, and she never came up with an actionable plan to get them. Trump's always known who his winnable voters are. And he has made an actionable plan to get them. Now, you might criticize this, but his plan to put big blanket tariffs, which he probably won't actually do, to be clear. He'll almost certainly raise tariffs, but likely not a blanket tariff. The blanket tariff is probably negotiating leverage to get better trade agreements, is what I'm saying. But that is pitching to the kind of voter he wants to win. The unionized manufacturing worker in the Rust Belt, increasingly in the Southeast, increasingly in the Southwest. Immigration is a big issue for a lot of people across the country, and Trump is solidly and firmly dominating that issue. It's an issue that 70% of Americans are concerned about. And Harris is, again, running away from immigration to talk about abortion again. The best you'll see from Walz or Harris is that, and you saw this during the VP debate very clearly, oh, the people are coming in legally to XY town or whatever. Oh, they're legally here. And yes, on paper, that might seem like a persuasive argument because the opposition is to illegal immigration. But the thing is, once again, issue polling is very misleading, and really, I strongly recommend you don't really pay much attention to it unless you want to really dive into it. But, and about a fine point to it, the average person doesn't actually understand or care about the difference between legal and legal immigration. When 70% say they want less illegal immigration, they just mean immigration. They want less immigrants. End of story. When you see voters at a Trump rally holding the mass deportations now sign, that voter isn't thinking, we're going to deport. If they're here legally, it's fine. Now, that's not to say that Trump is going to actually deport people illegally here in the U.S., but the voters want him to. In a lot of democracies right now, the voters want very strong action on immigration like that, but it's very unlikely that any party is actually going to give them that because, for various reasons that I won't get into in this video, governments like immigration. So, to sum this up, what we're really seeing in this election, and why it suddenly seems right now, out of nowhere, that Trump is regaining ground and people are confused and what is going on, is Harris is fading off on her welcome, her bump from taking leadership. But this isn't fading off her own voters. This is fading off other voters. In other words, people who were originally going to vote for Trump over Biden, but backed off because, hey, maybe Harris is better. Saw that all Harris cares about is talking about abortion for the most part. And she doesn't really care about immigration. And she doesn't really care about the economy. Or that her economic proposals are wishy-washy or weak or not what they want. Or all of the above. Now, does this mean as of October 21st, when this video comes out, that Harris is going to lose the election? No. I think if she comes out with a bold, strong platform or proposal, and she carries it for the next 18 days, she could probably win. But it would have to be something really bold that's actually going to expand her voter pool. Whereas pretty much every policy or action she's done thus far doesn't expand her voter pool. Many times, such as running away from Biden's tariffs, or not pushing Inflation Reduction Act or CHIPS Act like every single minute of her entire existence, hurts her. And again, we shouldn't be surprised by this, because we already saw a Kamala Harris national campaign when she ran for DNC in 2020. The 2020 primary, where she didn't even make it to the calendar year of 2020 before dropping out because she fizzled, because her political instincts are bad. Is it because she's bad at hiring staff? Maybe. But at the end of the day, her campaign doesn't know who they're trying to appeal to. It doesn't know what they're trying to do. They have time to fix these things, but they've shown no indication that they're even aware of how to do so. We saw a few ads coming out. There's the White Guys for Harris, which is already Poison Chalice campaign that's going to just alienate people. But I won't get into that here. Well, you're seeing things like they're trying to push Tim Walz as like a dad or like a tough dude or whatever. It's not going to work. Everyone can look at that guy and realize, he's generic. He doesn't have the pull they're trying to pretend he has. Or you'll see ads. There was a big one that came out. I could have played it here, but I don't have it queued up. Where they had a bunch of actors pretending to be... Anyways, a bunch of actors reading lines saying, this is why I'm a manly man. This is why I'm going to vote for the Democrats. But at the end of the day, their end thesis was, we're going to vote for the Democrats because of abortion. We're voting for Harris because the girls, I'm a man because I'm standing up for the girls in my life. And it's like, you had a mediocre idea and you just executed it terribly. You took an issue, like an ad that might have been okay, and then you just poisoned it by completely changing who you're trying to appeal to in the middle of the ad. It's silly. But again, this is one of the reasons why I haven't made many videos for this election, as opposed to BC or Canadian elections I made a lot of videos for. Because Trump is Trump. He's kind of boring to talk about at this stage. Everyone knows Trump. And the Harris campaign's been doing pretty bored. And now the Trump campaign's also not been doing a lot of great ideas. In the really broad strokes, the Republican Party has absolutely no idea what it's doing, except sometimes Trump does. And for the broad strokes, Kamala Harris has no idea what to do. Sometimes Democrats know what they're doing, but oftentimes they also don't know what they're doing. In a lot of regards, the US politics is just a lot of people who have no idea what they're doing with absurd amounts of money fighting against each other. And coming at this from a country where the politics sometimes is stupid, but at least people seem to know what they're doing. There's rationality to actions here. It feels weird. To put a fine Canadianism on it, it feels like at this stage, Kamala Harris is already full late-term Justin Trudeau syndrome, and she really hasn't even been in office a day. Yeah, she's been VP for 4 years, but no one really cares about the VP, let's be honest. But with that, I bid you adieu, and I'll see you next week with something else.